April 1204, the Fourth Crusade. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most powerful Christian centers in the world. The city gates were breached, soldiers poured into the streets. Homes were searched, palaces were seized, monasteries and churches were broken open. Gold, silver, relics, sacred vessels, everything was carried away. Some civilians were killed, some were captured. Wealthy families were held for ransom. Many people ran into churches for shelter, but in many parts of the city, even the churches were not spared. The hardest thing for many people in Constantinople to understand was not that the city was being attacked. It was that the men storming in also wore crosses on their clothes. For centuries, Constantinople had stood as a center of Byzantine power and as one of the great pillars of Christianity. Yet in 1204, that city was ravaged by an army that had answered the Pope's call. Why would a Christian expedition capture a Christian city? And more importantly, why did every crusade after the First Crusade fail? To answer that, we have to go back to 1099, right after Jerusalem was captured. Because from that victory, the fatal cracks in the crusading movement began to appear. July 1099, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. An army from Western Europe had crossed thousands of miles of unfamiliar land, survived hunger, thirst, disease, and internal conflict, and finally captured the city they had sworn to reach. That was the greatest goal of the expedition, and it was done. But immediately, the next question appeared. Who would rule Jerusalem? This was not an ordinary city in the eyes of Christians at the time. Jerusalem was tied to the life and death of Jesus Christ. Putting a secular king in charge of it was a sensitive problem. No one wanted to be the first person to claim ownership over the holiest place in the world. Godfrey of Bouillon, a nobleman from Lower Lorraine and one of the main leaders of the First Crusade, was chosen. Godfrey did not call himself King of Jerusalem. His exact title is still debated today, but one thing is clear. From that moment on, the Latins were no longer just pilgrims. They had begun to rule, and ruling was a completely different problem. A city could be captured in a few days, but holding it meant guards at the gates every night, food every month, money to pay soldiers every season, and allies close enough to send help during a siege. And it was not just Jerusalem. The entire network of fortresses, roads, ports, and coastal territories needed constant protection. But most of the people who joined the crusade had not come to build a long-term state. Many came because of a religious vow to complete the pilgrimage, fight for the faith, earn honor, and then return home. An expedition could bring thousands of people to the east in a matter of months. A territory had to be defended for years. That was the difference between taking Jerusalem and keeping Jerusalem. The First Crusade succeeded because several rare conditions came together at the same time. The Muslim powers in the region were deeply divided. The Crusaders still had the element of surprise. Jerusalem was clear enough as a shared goal to keep the Western European lords from splitting apart, and the Byzantine Empire was still strong enough to support the early stage. Those conditions did not automatically repeat themselves, and the later Crusades had to try to achieve the same result in a situation that had completely changed. The first sign of failure appeared only 2 years later. In 1101, news of the successful siege of Jerusalem in 1099 spread back to Europe and created a new wave of enthusiasm. People believed that the road to the east had been opened, that those who came later would only need to follow the old route, and Western Europeans continued sending more people along that same route toward Jerusalem, hoping to strengthen their presence there. But just because the Crusaders had passed through a region did not mean they actually controlled it. Anatolia, the large peninsula that makes up most of modern-day Turkey, was still territory dominated by Turkish forces. Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuk state of Rum, had studied the First Crusade carefully. He had seen how the Western European armies moved, where they were strong, and where they could be broken. When the Crusaders came a second time, he did not fight them head-on. He destroyed water sources, harassed and attacked smaller groups that became separated, and let heat and thirst weaken them before the major battle began. The armies of 1101 were defeated in Anatolia. Most of them never set foot in Syria or Jerusalem. The victory of 1099 may have looked easy, but it was not. It was the result of hundreds of factors lining up together, factors that were almost impossible to repeat. By the second expedition, everything had changed. In 1144, Edessa fell. Edessa was not Jerusalem, but it was one of the first Latin territories created after 1099, located far out on the frontier of modern-day Turkey and Syria. Difficult to reinforce and surrounded by powerful enemies. When Edessa fell, Europe understood that what had been captured could also be taken back. The Second Crusade was called with the original goal of retaking Edessa. But when the Crusaders reached the east, they changed direction and turned toward Damascus. That was not the original target, and it was not an easy target to control. The Crusader leaders were divided over strategy, and many believed Damascus was the more realistic target at that moment. The attack was rushed, and the leaders could not agree on whether to keep fighting or withdraw. After only a few days, they pulled back from Damascus without achieving anything. Edessa was not saved. Damascus was not captured. The Second Crusade failed because its commanders could not agree on a common goal from the beginning. In 1187, the Battle of Hattin. Saladin, the man who controlled both Egypt and Syria, and the strongest leader the Latins had ever faced, crushed the Crusader forces there and marched straight toward Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the symbolic city of the First Crusade, fell out of Latin hands after almost a century. Western Europe responded by sending some of its biggest names: Richard, the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a campaign on a scale Europe had never seen before. But Frederick died on the way. Philip left the campaign halfway through. Richard stayed, won several battles, and strengthened the Latin position along the coast. He came close enough to Jerusalem to see the towers of the city, and then suddenly turned back. Not because he did not dare to storm it, but because he knew the real question was not whether Jerusalem could be captured, but who would stay behind to hold it afterward. Would the army have enough men? Would the supply route from the coast be secure? If Saladin counterattacked immediately, could the city survive? The Third Crusade was not a complete failure. It preserved many important coastal positions and ensured that Christian pilgrims could still reach Jerusalem under certain conditions. But it did not achieve what 1099 had achieved. The First Crusade succeeded in a very specific moment. The Muslim powers in the region were still divided. But by the time of the Third Crusade, the situation had changed. Saladin had linked Egypt and Syria into a much larger power bloc, so Jerusalem was no longer the simple target it had once been. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, the breaking point was not on the battlefield. It came before the campaign even began. A large army that wanted to cross the Mediterranean needed ships, a lot of ships. Venice, a wealthy maritime city-state in northern Italy, had ships, a fleet, and experience in transport. But Venice also had its own goal, and that goal was money. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade signed a contract with Venice. Then, when the army gathered, they did not have enough money to pay. From that point on, the campaign began to slide away from its original direction. First, Venice demanded that the Crusaders attack Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast in present-day Croatia, to help cover the debt. They attacked and captured it. Then a Byzantine claimant to the throne appeared, promising money and support if the Crusaders helped him take Constantinople. The campaign turned again. After Constantinople was captured, the Crusaders still had not been paid. When the promised payment never came, the Crusaders turned to looting Constantinople. A religious campaign had become a violent debt collection. Debt, commercial interests, and Byzantine politics pushed the campaign farther and farther away, step by step, until no one could even remember the original purpose anymore. The larger a campaign became, the more it depended on other parties, ships, ports, money, allies, and political agreements. Any one of those factors could pull the campaign in a completely different direction. By the 13th century, many Crusader leaders had realized something. Attacking Jerusalem directly was often the fastest way to lose. The city was too far from the coast, the supply lines were too long, and the enemy knew exactly where the Crusaders would go. So instead, they targeted Egypt. Egypt was the source that sustained the enemy's power: wheat, money, soldiers, and fleets. If Egypt collapsed, the Crusaders could take Jerusalem afterward. That was the gamble of the Fifth Crusade. The Crusaders landed and captured Damietta, a port city guarding the mouth of the Nile. It was a good beginning. Too good, in fact, because they decided to push farther. But the Nile was not a river they were familiar with. During flood season, it rose and swallowed the fields, turning the marching routes into swamps. Soldiers marched barefoot through mud, slept in damp conditions, and drank from unfamiliar canals. Dysentery began to spread, then came fever. The men who had left Damietta healthy were no longer strong enough to fight by the time they approached Cairo. Meanwhile, their line of retreat grew more dangerous by the day. Supply ships had to move upriver. Egyptian defenders began cutting the waterways. They did not need to attack directly. They only needed to wait. In the end, the Crusaders had to trade Damietta for permission to retreat. They returned what they had captured in exchange for their lives. The greatest difficulty in Egypt did not come from major battles. It came from distance, terrain, climate, and the things the Crusader leaders did not truly understand before they set foot there. There was one crusade that cannot simply be called a failure, because it has the strangest story in the entire movement. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, did not come to the east with a massive army. He came with diplomats. And after months of negotiation, he achieved what so many wars had failed to achieve. Jerusalem was returned to the Crusader side through a treaty. Europe heard the news and did not know how to react. The Pope had excommunicated Frederick before he even left. An emperor cast out by the Church had managed to recover the holy city of Jerusalem by sitting down and talking with Muslims. That had no precedent in the crusading movement. But that victory was not a lasting result. Jerusalem returned to Latin hands without a strong enough garrison to hold it. There was no defensive line protecting the city if the Muslim side decided to break the treaty. This time, control was not based on military strength. It depended on the goodwill of the parties who signed the agreement and on the hope that the political situation would remain favorable. When the balance of power changed, Jerusalem quickly fell out of Latin hands once again. There was no great battle to tell. The city simply changed hands again, as if the treaty had never existed. Frederick recovered Jerusalem without war. But a city recovered through negotiation is difficult to defend without military power behind it. That was the paradox left by the Sixth Crusade. Their greatest success was also their most fragile success. Louis IX, King of France, believed in the Crusade more than any other European king of the 13th century. He did not go to the east because of political ambition or pressure from the Pope. He went because he truly believed in the campaign, and he chose Egypt as the target again. Damietta fell to the Crusaders once more, but from there the story played out almost exactly as it had before. They pushed deeper, the Nile rose, the road back was cut off, and disease spread faster than the soldiers could resist. Only this time, Louis did not manage to withdraw in time. He was captured along with most of the army that had survived. To ransom him, the French had to return Damietta and pay an enormous sum of money. The campaign ended worse than it began. The Crusaders already knew Egypt was dangerous. They had seen the Fifth Crusade drown in the mud of the Nile, but they had no better option. So they returned to the same place with the same hope and met the same ending. The Crusades did not lack courage, but they lacked clear goals and workable solutions. And the First Crusade had only managed to overcome those problems because of a special set of circumstances that would never happen again. After those failures, the Latins in the East began to pull back. Unable to control the interior, they clung to the only things still within reach: coastal cities, seaports, and fortresses strong enough to wait for help from far away. That was how they survived, not through strength, but through separation from the mainland and dependence on the sea. Acre became the most important city left. It was a port city on the eastern Mediterranean coast, crowded, chaotic, and filled with merchants, knights, clergy, and people who had nowhere else to go. For decades, Acre was all that remained of the dream that had begun in 1099. In 1291, the Mamluks attacked. The siege lasted nearly 2 months. When the walls collapsed, those who could not reach the ships in time were killed or captured. Templar and Hospitaller knights continued fighting in the last strongpoints until Acre completely collapsed. Then Acre fell. There was no city left to retreat to. There was no fortress left to hold. The Latins went out to sea and did not return. The crusading movement did not die immediately. Popes still called for new campaigns. Kings still made vows, and new plans were still drawn up on paper. But the era in which the Latins truly held land in the Holy Land, the era that began with Jerusalem in 1099, ended at Acre in 1291. Nearly 2 centuries, it ended not with one decisive defeat, but with the slow wearing down of a system that could not sustain itself. Today, the memory of the Crusades is often very simple. Only the First Crusade was a victory, while the later Crusades all failed. The real history is more nuanced. But when we look back at the entire chain of events from Jerusalem in 1099 to Acre in 1291, the reason for that view becomes clearer. The First Crusade ended with the capture of Jerusalem, the greatest objective, achieved by military force in a clear and undeniable way. The later attempts had no ending as clear as that. The Crusade of 1101 died in Anatolia before it ever reached its destination. The Second Crusade did not save Edessa. The Third Crusade won back the coast but did not retake Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade ended in Constantinople. The Fifth Crusade traded Damietta for a retreat. The Sixth Crusade recovered Jerusalem on paper, then lost it again without even needing a battle. The Seventh Crusade ended with Louis captured, Damietta returned, and a massive ransom paid. Looking at each campaign individually, there were still victories, cities changing hands, and treaties being signed. But when we look at the whole picture, most of the campaigns after 1099 revolved around one goal: holding or recovering what the First Crusade had achieved. That was also the problem the crusading movement never solved. Not because they lacked courage or faith, but because they failed to build a system durable enough to preserve victory over the long term. A structure that could feed itself, defend itself, and survive across generations without constantly waiting for reinforcements from Europe. Jerusalem in 1099 was the result of a special historical moment that could not easily be repeated. It took the Crusades nearly 2 centuries to realize that, and Acre in 1291 was the final conclusion.